Then I'd like to welcome everyone for this latest webinar organized by our research project, Staging National Abjection, Theater and Politics in Turkey and its Diasporas. My name is Rüstem Ertuğaltınay. I'm a visiting scholar at KHAS University and the principal investigator of the project. I'd like to thank European Research Council, which is funding our research on Turkey's minoritarian theater cultures and the politics of theater and belonging in Turkey and its diasporas for 5 years, as well as KHAS University, our host institution. And I'm also grateful for them for providing us with the infrastructure for creating this webinar series. Today, we are very excited to host Professor David Dean, whose work really inspires us. And we would like to thank Professor Dean for joining us. Tonight's moderator will be Rüya Kalıntaş. Rüya is a PhD student in communication studies at KHAS University and a member of our ERC research team. Rüya's dissertation focuses on the theater cultures of Turkey's transnational Alevi minority, with a particular interest in the politics of memory, historiography, trauma, and gender in contemporary and recent theater practices. Thank you all again for joining us. Rüya, the floor is yours.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the third week of our KHAS ERC Performance and Politics webinar series. I want to remind you all that this meeting will be recorded, so you'll be able to watch it on our YouTube channel. My name is Rüya Kalıntaş, and I'm a researcher here at the ERC-funded project, Staging National Abjection, Theater and Politics in Turkey and its Diasporas. As a team of our project, we are really grateful to our kind host, KHAS University, and European Research Commission for their generous support. Today, Professor David Dean will give a talk titled Performing Public History, and I will be moderating the webinar. After the talk, we will open the Q&A session for your questions. So before introducing our guests, first of all, I would like to remind you all that if you would like to be notified of our future events, you can follow Staging National Abjection on Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, and YouTube. You may see the information of our social media outlets now on the screen. Yes. You may be notified via email as well if you leave your email address in the chat box. So now I would like to introduce our speaker, Professor David Dean, who's a professor of history and the co-director of the Carleton Center for Public History at Carleton University in Canada. As a public historian, he's especially interested in historical representation and history telling in theater, film, and other forms of performance. And his recent focus has been on dramatic representations of witchcraft and social inequality. This is very interesting as well. He actively collaborates with museums, theater amateurs, and professionals, and with community activists to explore innovative ways of making history visible in our everyday lives. So, Professor David Dean, welcome again, and thank you for kindly accepting our invitation. Now the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you, Rüya, for a lovely introduction. So everyone, I'm going to share my screen, and so hopefully everything will work. I'm just going to toggle everything. There we go. So hopefully everyone can see the PowerPoint presentation, okay? And if there are some links and some videos, some embedded, some external links. So we'll work out whether you can hear the sound of those. And I won't reenact them myself. I had to do that at a conference once. My video was playing at maybe 0.2 speed. And so I ended up acting it out, but I won't put you through that today. So it's a really great pleasure to be invited to talk here today. And as Rüya said, I teach at Carleton University in Ottawa here in Canada, and I want to acknowledge that I am privileged to work on in the territory, the unceded territory, stolen territory of the Algonquin and Anishinaabe people. And I'm very grateful to their custodianship of the land. And I'm committed to find ways of exploring ways of enhancing and supporting reconciliation efforts in our country and in our locality. Performing public history is something that I've been engaging with for some time now, and I really want to spend today sharing my journey as a public historian and my engagement with theater and with performance, and really things that I'm still working through even 10 years after some of those engagements, and I want to share that with you today. I suspect that some of you won't be completely familiar or comfortable with the term public history. So I wanted to explain a little bit about what it is. Public history is essentially about how publics engage with the past, how they encounter the past, how they encounter the writing of history in the public sphere. So we often, recent conference call for papers, describe this as history for the public, history about the public, history with the public, and history by the public. And as all of those suggest, it's a dynamic field. It's a relatively new field in terms of academic university departments. But the practice and what we do as public historians is as old as history and as old as the past itself in terms of storytelling. But as those descriptions suggest, there's different types of dynamics going on when we talk about public history. So public history for the public or about the public suggests that there are specialists, trained people who curate the past and represent the past in the public sphere for public consumption. And the public is more or less passive in that consumption. History with the public implies a level of collaboration between those specialists and publics that they are addressing, that they're part of the public that they're addressing. And history by the public is sort of, instead of a top-down public history, it's a bottom-up public history where specialists might not be involved at all. So public historians work on history and film, on graphic novels, web platforms, museums, and archives. And the image that I just showed here is an image of a courtyard, an exhibit space. So it used to be an orphan school, and these were the cubbies that the children used to put their clothes and possessions in. And now it's been converted to an exhibit space, which is actually turned over to the community to create their own exhibits. So it's a really great example of public history in action. So public history is, as a field of history, is multimodal, where we engage with a range of forms of history writing. It's interdisciplinary, it's collaborative, and it's co-productive. And this is an example of one of the projects I work on, where we've put over 60 now installations across the city, wrapping traffic control boxes, which are largely large gray dull boxes with an archival image and a link to a website to learn more diverse stories. So this is an example of, it's multimodal, it's not a traditional monograph, chapter, lecture. It's interdisciplinary in that I work with designers and local historians. It's collaborative because we produce it, and it's co-productive because we all produce it together. And so I share my authority, I share my involvement. I'm just one partner in this, and my expertise is just one expertise. I think I must have a timer going on here for some reason. But what I want to talk about today is my journey from what I might say consultation to collaboration. And I want to begin with really where I began as a historian, where I analyzed performance as a point of engagement. Essentially what I was doing was, if I looked at a historical film or went to a theater production, I analyzed it as a historical representation. And the tools at my disposal to do that were the tools I had as a professionally trained historian, which was to look at original manuscripts, convert those manuscripts or use those manuscripts to make an argument and produce a monograph and so on. So I was sort of using the tools that were really designed to produce monographs, articles and books for peer review and dissemination maybe to students as my point of engagement. So I was analyzing performance as historical representation, and I was at a distance from it. I was like this very informed critic, external critic. And I'd say that most historians are still at this point where we analyze performance of the past as historical representation. And I'd like to sort of suggest by the end of today that there's an argument for encouraging historians to move beyond that way of engagement, that form of engagement. When we analyzed the veracity of performance, of the representations we were looking at, we usually did so through how accurate they were, how authentic they were. In other words, how well they corresponded to what we knew about the past through our sources, through our archive research, through our discussions with colleagues, through our interpretations and our many arguments with colleagues about what happened or how things happened or what the consequences of what happened were. So we assess veracity through accuracy and authenticity. And the assumption there was that if you were historically accurate, you would capture some authenticity in representing the past. Historians might acknowledge the creative process in this, but because they're external to that creative process, they're not part of it, they don't really understand it, and they usually sort of either excuse or dismiss these sorts of performative acts as artistic license. So the mistakes were artistic license, and that's so we shouldn't really take film and theater, opera, graphic novels that seriously as forms of historical production, because they're necessarily inaccurate or inauthentic. They're necessarily problematic because they're not, because they can't fulfill the criteria that we use for assessing our normal historical work. And artistic license is the excuse used to distort or mistaken or override certain things that we wouldn't do in our monographs. Having done that though, but I had the privilege of being part of the creative process as an embedded historian in a theater company for several years. And I then began to understand the creative process and be part of that. And in doing that, I began to recognize the synergy that my own training as a historian, my own work as a historian had with the creative work being that was happening in the rehearsal room, in the script work, in the final performance, and so on. And in fact, I saw a lot of parallels between what I did as a historian and the creative work that I was witnessing and was privileged to be part of. And that led me to rethink the historian's craft, to think of the historian as a performer, and the media that I normally work in, books and chapters, as also having a creative element to it. And that I needed to acknowledge that creative element and wrestle with the implications of this. So I had to rethink the historian's craft, and I'm in the process of doing that now. And then finally, my big challenge, because I'm a teacher, not just a researcher, was how to share all of that with my students and to share it with others, but particularly my students. So what I'm going to do for the rest of the talk today is take us through the first few elements, from representation through to engagement in creativity, talk in some detail about what I think the implications are for the historian's craft in this work. But I especially want to spend hopefully half of my talk showcasing some of my students' work, because one of the most wonderful things about this whole journey for me has been how students have grabbed hold of it, taken charge of it, turned it into their own things, done things things with it that have been humbling and impressive and really quite extraordinary. And I hope you agree by the end of the talk that some of their work is really pretty special and pretty innovative. So just to cover my journey in one slide, in round about 2006, 2007, I began to be involved in the English Theatre Company, which is our English language theatre company here in Ottawa. It's the National Arts Centre, so it's a national theatre company. And I eventually became company historian, which meant I was embedded and was part of the process from the very first meetings that we had over script work through to table work, to blocking, to rehearsals, right through to final productions. And I was involved in a number of productions, some of which I'll talk about in a minute. So that's my life here on the left. On the right is conveying that to students, both as a supervisor of MA and PhD students, but also in a seminar called Narrativity and Performance in Public History, which I introduced in 2006 as a result of this sort of work with the theatre company. And it's also had a deep effect on my research. So I've been doing a lot of collaborative work with theatre colleagues, diaspora specialists, and performance studies specialists, and it's resulted in 2 edited collections. The first one is History, Memory, Performance in 2015, and Kate Johnson's here listening to us today. She's was one of the great contributors of this. And oops, I think I must have a timer, sorry about that. And more recently, this last year, Migration and Stereotypes in Performance and Culture came out, which I think has probably some of the essays would resonate with the project that you're all engaged with, I think, very directly. My work in theatre, let me talk a little bit about what it was. As I said, I had engaged with theatre as representation, usually as an outside critic, and usually not all that complimentary. I kept on, it's like watching a historical film. You can't, as a historian, not point out the inaccuracies, the problems with it, and get frustrated with it, and sort of hope your students don't watch them and see them and repeat them in essays. I learned early on in my work on film that I needed to understand the language of film. And so I availed myself of opportunities to learn about camera work and film shots. And so began to engage with film as opposed to judging it as if it was a monograph. And when I began to be involved in theater, I sort of went through the same process. But initially, my role in the theater company was to be a living historian, a living Wikipedia, a living archive. They wanted certainty. They wanted me to answer questions. And they saw history in a way that history was essentially, I was a sort of a living person from the past, almost in their presence. I could answer questions, and they wanted accurate answers and certain answers. And they kept on getting a little frustrated with me because I would give them possibilities, because history is not certain. The archive is not complete. There's gaps, there's silences, many things we don't know. And historians will argue to the end of time about every single potential certainty. So I was giving them possibilities, and eventually we came to the realization that was actually quite productive. But when it came to, for example, the press, this on the right is an article that appeared in my role in the Romeo and Juliet production. They assumed that my role as a historian was to help the company get the facts right. And that's really all I was there for, was to make sure that things were accurate and factually accurate. And that, of course, was something that potentially is how people see historians, but it's not how we see ourselves necessarily. And so I was involved in a number of productions where we, yes, I contributed a lot. I think in terms of detail, in terms of resource material, in material culture, discussions about how historians understood things. So for example, with A Christmas Carol, production, I actually fed them the diet that a workhouse inmate would have, so they had an understanding of how much protein people would actually get for a week, and little things like that. Talked about the 30 Years' War as well as the 20th century Brecht's time with the Mother Courage production. Romeo and Juliet was a lot of archival work for me because the actors wanted to have certain answers. So, for example, one quick example. They wanted to know, would servants ever strike a master? And the traditional reading that they did on Wikipedia was that no, it was a very hierarchical, male-dominated society. Everyone obeyed the manuals. And I pointed out, well, historians argue that the reason you need these manuals for good behavior is because people actually aren't behaving well. And I was able, because I'm a trained historian, I was able to go into the archives, pull out examples of where servants were taken to court by their masters for hitting them. And I would give that material to the actors. And so the actors, then we collectively decided, well, if it's playable, if it works with the dramaturgy, if it works with the director's vision, if it works with the script, then why not have a servant strike a master and see how that plays out? Because so in some ways I was giving them permission to do certain things based on my historical knowledge and my historical expertise. So I was there is a consultant, there is a walking Wikipedia, if you like. There's a resource where I could answer questions by going right back to sources very quickly and make them available. But also I was aware of all the debates and controversies that historians engage in these various time periods. So I was able to bring an interpretive element of what the work we do as historians, rather than just factual knowledge. But when it came to my involvement, deep involvement in some productions, I realized that there was a lot of synergy and a lot of between the work I was doing and the creative work done by the actors, by the dramaturg, by the director, by the stage managers and music designers, lighting designers, and so on, that went way beyond just simply factual background information and getting the details right. And it led me to start rethinking certain fundamentals of my craft. So I want to just give you a few examples of that and just take a couple of themes of that. I'm going to try and move this so I can actually see what I'm doing here. So, for example, theater's representation. As I said earlier, there tends to be an assumption in public history that if you're historically accurate, your representation of the past will be authentic and the audience will realize that. So one of my first deep involvements, was with the production of Macbeth. And I came in, and Macbeth, as you know, Shakespeare play written in the early 17th century, meant to flatter the new Scottish king of England, of Britain, and it has witches. So I came in and I gave a 3-hour talk or something like that. I get carried away on the period of history, the James's monarch, his notion of divine monarchy, and of course about the social tensions of the time and witchcraft. I talked a lot about witches, and we went off for a break. Everybody seemed very happy, and they were hundreds of questions, and I'd never felt so energized being in that sort of table work, that script work with actors. And we had a break, and then the director, Peter Hinton, came back and said, well, lovely, David, that was really interesting. However, we don't have witches in our Macbeth. There are no witches. And I said, what? You can't have Macbeth without witches. That popped out. And what lay behind that was that, A, I'd never seen a Macbeth without witches, but B, that wasn't authentic, that wasn't accurate. How can you change the script and not have witches? How can you do something to capture the authentic experience of the 17th century without having witches in Macbeth? I mean, I just, and I wrestled with it, and I wrestled with it for 3 or 4 weeks. What had happened is the play was situated in the middle of this 20th century. It was a sort of fascism, democracy, sort of battles going on. And the witches were these three children. They were children evacuees fleeing London from bombing. And there was a moment in the rehearsal where there's a scene, as you all know, in Macbeth, where the witches ridicule Macbeth for ever believing him. And in the rehearsal, the actor playing Macbeth came out, and he was sweating and he was shaking because these children had piled such vicious language on him and such intensity, drawn, I'm sure, from schoolroom, from playground politics or whatever, that they were really nasty and really vicious and really triumphant and mocking him. And it was really strong. And I took that away, and then I while I was sitting every production, I used to sit with the audience and feel what the audience was feeling. And what I realized had happened is that, and where the director was brilliant in this, is that, you know, modern audiences don't take witches very seriously. Most modern audiences do. Certainly a local audience in Canada, in Ottawa, doesn't. But they take children seriously. Out of the mouth of babes is an English phrase, that children speak truth. And I realized that in some science fiction films, the supernatural often gets entry to our natural world through children. Thinking of Poltergeist and things. So what happened was that the audience got a sense of children being valuable and essential and natural and important in the world, but also being terrifying and having power, and that could really scare you and really could frighten you and really could be dangerous. And that's exactly what witches were. All my reading of witchcraft in the 16th century, 17th century, that's what witches were for contemporary people. So I realized what had happened here is that we had been historically inaccurate, but it captured something authentic about the 17th century that I don't think we would have captured had we actually performed witches. At least that was a possibility. And at least that was something I had to sort out in my head and work through. And since then, I've begun to play with several articles and things and trying to separate accuracy from authenticity and to theorize a bit about that and see what it means in practice. One production that I did that with was the King Lear production, because we had to change Shakespeare's script to make it fit our context. Our context, we moved it from Shakespeare's time and Shakespeare himself was playing with time, right? It's a play set in early Britain, played in the 16th, 17th century, in the early 17th century. So he's playing with time and space as well. We played with time and space. We played with space, and then we moved it to early Canada, the moment of contact between Europeans and Indigenous peoples. But it was actually accurate to Shakespeare's time. It was round about Shakespeare's time, the time of some of the early explorers in 1604, actually in our local area, actually had come down the river. So we were exploring different contexts in this play, both the early Canadian context. So Lear's New World, the European world that is introduced, is all about private property and the ability to divide your property, which of course is an alien concept to Indigenous peoples. And so we costumed the actors, so those who were inclined to support Lear in this sort of new European world order, dressed with some European elements in their dress, and others were traditionalists and refused it. And that was part of the tension. But for us, there's also a contemporary context, and that context is the genocide, increasing recognition of the genocide of Indigenous peoples here in Canada, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission and discussions around murdered and missing Indigenous women. Some of that wasn't absolutely clear or sorted out, or at least reported on at the time of that production, but it was all there. It was all part of it. We were on unceded territory, on stolen land, and in this production, and the horrors and the traumas that we settlers have imposed on is something we're still working out. But that was the context for both our production, the creative team, the acting company, but also, of course, the audience. And it's something that we were very aware of at the time in 2012. But increasingly this has increased in intensity, of course, recently, very powerfully and very horrifically. So context was important. Context of the Vimy play, which is this last one here, was also important because we were fighting a war in Afghanistan. And so a play about the First World War, Canadians in the First World War, played very particularly to audiences some of whom had sons or daughters fighting in Afghanistan. There were debates about whether we should be there at the time. And I've written an article very early on this, where we actually did a survey of the audience, and we did some interesting questions about how theater worked as in enhancing historical understanding and historical consciousness. What I learned from all of that production was that theater, in terms of newly performing the past, it involves a form of what the theater scholar, I'm sure you all know, Freddie Rokem, talks about, hyperhistorians, that there's a hyper reality that we're witnessing the past anew. It's not the same past that the past that happened or that we think happened, but it is happening again, and it's happening before us, and it's involved with us. We're witnessing it. And as observers of the past that's happening in our own present, I think we learn things about the past. In some ways, I think what we do is we're returning to the past, its own present as well. And lastly, I came out of all of this thinking that theater has to be taken seriously, not just by historians, not just as forms of historical representation that need to be critiqued and analyzed externally, but as a really important historiographical intervention, enhancing understanding, enhancing historical consciousness, historical awareness, but in some ways just as important, if not in terms of audiences, more important than some of the traditional products that we do as historians. Sorry, I'm going through this. So I think all of these things were significant for me, and there's others, but critiquing theater's representation led me to disengage accuracy and authenticity, and to think much more about audience and reception. Thinking about context, both the context of the script as originally written, the context in which we're staging the play, the context in which we are working and the audience is receiving and is part of it. Because as you all know, much better than I, the audience begins performing as part of our collaborators from the moment they start walking towards the theater. Theater also is as newly performing the past, involving a process of witnessing, and I thought that was really interesting for me as a historian, thinking of myself as a witness of the past, and then taking it seriously as a historiographical intervention, which is a new opportunity for historians to re-engage with theater, not simply as representation, but as historiography, as an important intervention, and something we need to take deeply seriously. And in order to make sense of that, we need to understand how it works, and we need to understand the medium. So let me sum up a little bit, or explore this a little bit in a bit more detail, and then I'll turn to some examples. Theorizing what we do and how we do it, thinking about our ethical and moral obligations as privileged witnesses to the past. That's something that I think is one of my first takeaways from that experience, that we need to think about why we do what we do and how we do it, and our obligations to the dead, because we are privileged witnesses to the past. Historians, it encourages historians to recognize the creativity and the role of imagination in our nonfiction writing, if you like, our own performativity. Someone that I know had an influence on Kate's work and my own work, Greg Denning, the Australian historian, talks about historians as performers. And so I think, we are witnesses in the archive. We are witnesses as writers. We are witnesses in the new performances. So witnessing the past and recognizing the creativity in our imagination in as we work through this witnessing process is important. Acknowledge our own subjectivity and encourage reflexivity in our desire to close historical distance. The gap between the past and the present is something that I think I learned from this, and public historians are very open to this. So not insisting that somehow the technologies of what we do, the tools of our trade, make us objective, that we are actually subjective, and we need to bring that out in our work. To think critically about our claims to authenticity and authority through source citation. We claim authority as if we're sort of conduits of the past, that it's unfiltered what we report from our sources. In fact, of course, we are filters. We're brokers. We're mediators. We're almost translators between past and present. And to recognize that there may be historical truth based on the fragments of reality that have survived. We know there are silences in those archives. We know that they are partial, that they themselves are forms of authority. But to recognize that when we read those archives, when we look at those sources, we're using conjecture, we're using inference, we're using our imagination, we're even inventing some things with strong probability based on other sources. So that we're dealing with a form of historical truth then that is fragmented, that is partial, that is inferred, that is somewhat conjectured, and that relates very nicely or has synergy with artistic truth, if you like. Or put it another way, a phrase I love from an anthropologist, a Canadian anthropologist, Julie Cruikshank. What is the relationship between the lived reality that we research as historians and the storied reality that we write or produce in film or theater or graphic novels or video games or whatever? So what's the relation between the lived reality we think we know and the storied reality that results from that? So recognizing our role as translators and mediators, value the multimodal, various forms of historical production, and embrace the fact and seek the opportunities that are offered through affect, through emotions, through empathy, for embodiment. Things that are very subjective and very powerful in the theater and in film and in video games and so on. But some historians resist those and are very worried about those. And then finally, to think about if we accept that the media that we're working in, whether it's theater or film or video game or graphic novel, that helps to shape the content, shapes the message, that we need to understand those forms and from the inside out in order to really engage with them on their own terms. Let's step back as historians and think about what we do and what we value, or what we think we do objectively, which is write books and write articles and chapters and give lectures and talks. How has that as a medium shaped our storytelling? And how does it challenge our storytelling? And would it be different if we did other things? So think about our conventional forms as actually being a choice and something that actually speaks to these other forms of representation. So that's sort of my thinking as I came through all of this. And, you know, as I think about how to teach it, I began to teach it in a grad seminar that I started in, I think, 2006. I argue that historians have always sought new ways of exploring the past, but the performative turn has had a deep impact on that. It's obviously had an impact on me through my work with the theater company and subsequent performative acts. Asking students to think about why we want to tell the histories and the stories we tell, and what we want to achieve in the telling of those stories, thinking about audience. And the idea is that they actually do a performance. And They can do a final research paper if they want, but almost all students in the class choose to do a performance. I've had students dance their thesis, do original music composition, shoot little documentary films, use puppets, just an incredible range of things. And I just want to say at the outset, I've never been in tears at the end of a seminar as I've been with this seminar, because the students, you know, often choose stories that are deeply personal, deeply troubling. They work through some personal challenges and even traumas, conflicts of belonging and of identity. And there we managed to create a space in the class that they feel able to share those stories. And it's been a pretty profound experience. So I want to, share this and we'll see if this works. This is the story of one of the first productions that was done.
I write a lot of essays for school, but I also write sales descriptions for my Etsy shop.
I use Grammarly on my work email.
My name is Catherine, and this is me.
So I just want to check. Can everyone hear that?
Yes, we can hear.
Yep. Okay, great. Okay. So here we go.
Well, not actually me. Really, it's a representation. A paper puppet that has been made to look a little like me. You get the idea. But don't worry, I'll throw in a couple of pictures to ground this video in some kind of reality. Some will even be in black and white, which is perfect since this video is for a history course after all. Anyway, I want to talk about my grandparents and their stories. This is more of a challenge than it might seem. As I think we're all aware of by now, telling stories involves a lot of choices. What do I include? Or even harder, exclude? How can I best give you a sense of what I want to say while still respecting the constraints of time and the medium I've chosen? Creating and editing always involves a certain amount of destruction, and this is something I have to deal with. But for me, it's still worth a try. So here it goes. This is my Oma and Opa on their wedding day on June 10th, 1951. They lived on the family farm in the middle of nowhere, Manitoba. Ever heard of Sturpern? Vida? Maybe Tolstoy? My point exactly. My parents eventually moved from the bustling city of Winnipeg to the family farm, so I was lucky enough to live right across the road from my grandparents on my dad's side. Naturally, they figure pretty prominently in my childhood memories. My Opa was a pretty cool guy. I think you'd like him. It was hard not to. He was a great improviser and could almost always find a way to fix a problem with whatever materials he had on hand. Honestly, I think half the farm is held together with baling twine. He was also a great storyteller, and many of his tales of growing up in rural Manitoba have become part of our family lore. One of my favorites involves a Halloween prank some of the boys in the area were planning on one of my Opa's neighbors, Mr. Miller. As the boys were making their way to the farm to do their mischief, Mr. Miller saw them coming. He grabbed his shotgun, snuck up behind them, and shot over their heads to give them a scare. After chasing them around for a little bit, he invited them inside the house where they chatted over coffee. My Oma was pretty great too. She was an incredibly warm and welcoming person, but was pretty fierce when she needed to be. There's a story in our family that she once got rid of some rats that had gotten into the chicken coop by trapping them in a corner and then stomping on them. You didn't mess with my Oma. She had a pretty rough life growing up. She was born in the Ukraine in 1922 and was the middle child in a family of 6 siblings. Her family experienced the deportation of kulaks to labor camps, the collectivization of farms, and the Second World War. At one point, when my Oma was about 9 or 10, the whole family wound up in a labor camp in the Ural Mountains. They were just dropped off in the middle of nowhere and left to survive on their own.
Oh.
While she and her brother and sisters were soon released, and her mother managed...
So it stopped playing?
We cannot see the video. We can hear it, but we cannot see the video.
Yeah, we only have the audio.
Oh, sorry. Okay, hold on.
It may be because like you may have shared it from another tab.
Oh, yes. Okay, hold on. That would make sense. Right. Okay. I thought because I was using a video, a YouTube link, that would be better. Can you see that now?
We can see, but if you play it, then we can.
Oops, sorry. No, it's not gonna work. Okay, hold on. Sorry. Stop. Okay, let me go back to screen share. Can you see that now?
No.
No.
It's blank.
Blank,
It's
okay.
white screen.
Okay, hold on. Let me
Maybe
try
you can
something
stop
different here.
this share and
Yeah, I think
share
that's,
the YouTube.
yeah. Hold on, sorry. Oh, gosh, that's not right. Okay. You can see my screen now.
Yes, it's
It's a blank screen.
black
Yeah.
screen.
Okay. So
My name is Catherine, and this is me. Well, not actually
how's
me.
that?
Really,
Now
it's a
it's me.
representation.
Yes, it's working.
Okay, good. Are you fine time-wise? Because we'll be another 20 minutes or so.
No,
Anyway.
we're all
Of course,
fine.
of
Don't
course.
worry.
You're okay? Okay.
A
Can you
paper
make it
puppet that has
bigger,
been made to
little?
look a little like me. You get the idea. But don't worry, I'll
So is
throw in a
everything
couple.
working well now?
Yes, it's playing. Yes, we can
Okay,
see the video.
good.
Thank you.
Okay.
Pictures to ground this video in some kind of reality. Some will even be in black and white, which is perfect since this video is for a history course after all. Anyway, I want to talk about my grandparents and their stories. This is more of a challenge than it might seem. As I think we're all aware of by now, telling stories involves a lot of choices. What do I include? Or even harder, exclude? How can I best give you a sense of what I want to say while still respecting the constraints of time and the medium I've chosen? Creating and editing always involves a certain amount of destruction, and this is something I have to deal with. But for me, it's still worth a try. So here it goes. This is my Oma and Opa on their wedding day on June 10th, 1951. They lived on the family farm in the middle of nowhere, Manitoba. Ever heard of Sturkburn? Vida? Maybe Tolstoy? My point exactly. My parents eventually moved from the bustling city of Winnipeg to the family farm, so I was lucky enough to live right across the road from my grandparents on my dad's side. Naturally, they figure pretty prominently in my childhood memories. My Opa was a pretty cool guy. I think you'd like him. It was hard not to. He was a great improviser and could almost always find a way to fix a problem with whatever materials he had on hand. Honestly, I think half the farm is held together with baling twine. He was also a great storyteller, and many of his tales of growing up in rural Manitoba have become part of our family lore. One of my favorites involves a Halloween prank some of the boys in the area were planning on one of my Opa's neighbors, Mr. Miller. As the boys were making their way to the farm to do their mischief, Mr. Miller saw them coming. He grabbed his shotgun, snuck up behind them, and shot over their heads to give them a scare. After chasing them around for a little bit, he invited them inside the house where they chatted over coffee. My Oma was pretty great too. She was an incredibly warm and welcoming person, but was pretty fierce when she needed to be. There's a story in our family that she once got rid of some rats that had gotten into the chicken coop by trapping them in a corner and then stomping on them. You didn't mess with my Oma. She had a pretty rough life growing up. She was born in the Ukraine in 1922 and was the middle child in a family of 6 siblings. Her family experienced the deportation of kulaks to labor camps, the collectivization of farms, and the Second World War. At one point, when my Oma was about 9 or 10, the whole family wound up in a labor camp in the Ural Mountains. They were just dropped off in the middle of nowhere and left to survive on their own. While she and her brother and sisters were soon released, and her mother managed to escape, which is an incredible story, by the way, her father eventually died in the camp, probably from starvation or disease. My Oma told me that when her mother finally made it back to the children, she had to pretend to be their aunt. The older children, of course, knew the truth, but they had to keep the younger ones in the dark in order to avoid disaster should someone question them about their mother being around. My great-uncle cried when he told me he didn't recognize her when she first came home, and how painful that must have been for her. After the war, my Oma immigrated to Canada in 1949, where she met and married my Opa. Most of her family followed her, save 2 sisters who had been caught on the eastern side of the Iron Curtain at the end of the war. Oma wouldn't see them again until the 1980s. When I was in high school, my Oma had a stroke, and it suddenly became very urgent to piece together her story. So I started speaking to extended family and interviewing her while she was in the personal care home in Vida. It was a long process, and I knew nothing about how to conduct an oral history interview. I didn't even record our conversations. Oh, and my dad had to help out because sometimes she felt more comfortable speaking in German, and he had to translate. It wasn't an ideal interview situation, but it was so worth it. Now, of course, this is only a taste of who my grandparents were and the kinds of stories I remember from them. There's so much more I could tell you, but like I said, editing involves choices, and I had to make a lot of them. I couldn't tell their whole story even if I tried. First of all, my Oma and Opa naturally edited themselves in front of me and my siblings. And second of all, there are some stories I wouldn't want to tell. I truly believe my grandparents' stories have real historical worth, however you might want to define that. I could explain that my Opa's experiences speak to rural life and community in southern Manitoba, and that my Oma's stories are representative of many people who survived living in Eastern Europe during the Second World War. Even so, you can probably tell that there's a heavy serving of nostalgia when I talk about them. I have deep emotional ties to these people and the stories they shared with me. I can't distance myself from their stories, and I wouldn't want to. Why are we so hard on nostalgia anyways? Because the real reason I want to tell my grandparents' stories is because I miss them. And do I really need any other justification? I guess that's up to you.
Okay, so that was one of the, oh, sorry. This is not, okay, hold on. Don't know why we're getting that. Hold on, sorry.
I think we have a question because a raised hand, no. You didn't raise your hand, right? Professor Altanay, no? No, sorry. It's okay, we can keep going. You are muted, I guess, Professor Dean.
Sorry, I'm just trying to work something out because I'm on. Sorry, there was something very strange going on. I was getting it automatically played the next YouTube clip. So I wanted to, so I was listening to bagpipe music. Okay, so are we back again? We're all fine? Okay, I'm going to share this story. Hopefully this will work.
Oh, there's a bunch.
The sound and everything's working? Okay, good.
Yes.
So more recent productions have involved students actually doing an online performance. So Danny here is describing his encounter with the archive. So his performance as a historian in the archive, encountering a story of a game designer.
Oh, also a bunch of material on Seven Seas of Gold in the other magazines. That's so much stuff. That's so good. She was great. She did a lot of stuff. Actually, there's some stuff on Mule too, but I don't see her on the picture. I mean, there's a woman, but that's not her. Wait. Oh Christ, that'll teach me. She was trans, and I didn't look it up because I sped read through the article. Good, very, very good. Good, Danny. Good job. Plus, that was like 25 years ago. That couldn't have been great. That's interesting. In the list of names, there's a Bill Bunn. She created the company with her brother. That's pretty neat. I guess they had a decent relationship. Well, there's also a bunch of material on Seven Seas of Gold in the other magazines. That's so much stuff. That's so good. She was great. She did a lot of stuff. Actually, there's some stuff on Mule too, but I don't see her on the picture. I mean, there's a woman, but that's not her. Wait. Oh Christ, that'll teach me. She was trans, and I didn't look it up because I sped read through the article. Good, very, very good. Good, Danny. Good job. Plus, that was like 25 years ago. That couldn't have been great. That's interesting. In the list of names, there's a Bill Bunn. She created the company with her brother. That's pretty neat. I guess they had a decent relationship. I mean, they worked together, so it had to be. Right, time to go through our personal stuff. Oops. It's a little voyeur in a way. Don't like the feeling. Guess I'll get over it. Woo! Pictures. Yay. Looks like it's a priest protest at a university campus. She must have been in her early 20s, probably, when she was getting her degree in engineering in the 1960s. Wait, is that her in the middle of the picture? Wait, oh no. This, okay. Is that her in the middle of the picture? What is she doing? There's a peace sign around her neck. She's in camel clothes. But what, is that a Nazi salute? I'm getting a serious vibe that she was trolling the American government and calling them fascists for still being in Vietnam. That's so interesting. I seriously hope that she was trolling though, because if not, I'm going to be seriously disappointed. It reminds me of my little involvement in the Quebec student movement in 2012. So many people in the streets couldn't shut up about it. I mean, I have trouble shutting up just naturally anyway, but I guess I wanted to compensate from the fact that I wasn't in the front lines by just talking to whoever was interested and those who weren't. I felt part of a community for once. It felt really nice. All right, more stuff. Hospital documents. Interesting. It's in there. This file says, papers from father. Looks like it was her writing. I guess it was her writing on these sheets. It's not her father, actually. Probably came from her father, I guess. Oh, yeah. It's when she got her Adam's apple shaved and her vocal cords modified. She couldn't talk. Of course she couldn't talk. So she wrote down what she wanted to say. She couldn't eat either. This line, I choke every time I try to swallow my own spit. That must have been horrible. She seemed so scared of getting an infection and the weird discoloration of her skin. This is heavy. But wait, there's more. I haven't slept, eaten, or drunk anything, I haven't slept, eaten, or drunk anything, or slept more than 10 minutes at a time for 2 days. No wonder I'm a bit frazzled. Yeah, that's fair. I'd probably be the same, I guess.
Okay, and that Danny has followed up with research on that and found out that there's some really intriguing ways in which
balconies are open doors. When I think of the balcony, balconies are open. The archive was curated in order to eliminate the trans nature of this particular game designer. And the last clip I want to show you from the class is Cassandra's reflections on her family living in Montreal, Italian family in Montreal. Oh. Balconies are open doors. When I think of the balconies in my life, I imagine open doors behind them. I imagine the sounds, heavy wooden doors swollen and humid from the Montreal heat, unsticking from their frames with a generous push. Screen doors sliding open like a zipper, cutting through the chirps of the cicadas. The balconies have other sounds too. Loud voices, long stories that twist and turn with interruptions, laughter. Balconies are laughter. I feel like I could talk on and on about balconies, but I also don't know what to say. Do you know that feeling? Somewhere, some part, some ghost of a thought in your body has it all figured out, and it's desperately trying to make you get it, but you can't always do it justice. I remember the balconies, I can picture the balconies, I still live with those balconies in places I call home, but what they want me to know, what they whisper to the ghost of thoughts in my body cannot be translated. And so I grasp at straws, I tell half stories that make me smile, I recreate new balconies where these stories can live comfortably as a series of actions and interactions with imagined meanings and deep significances and all those literary devices we learn about in school: foreshadowing, illusion, hyperbole. That's our performance, true storytelling. And so to tell you about our balconies is to tell you about all the imaginary places we inhabited. It's to have conversations with spaces that may or may not have been real, but not worrying about those distinctions. It's to accept that I'm telling you something in between. It's the feeling of those nanoseconds in the air as we jumped from one stone to another, when we felt not quite here or there, when time compressed, realities collided, and the possibilities were endless. And it's to tell you about my own imaginaries here and now, as I perform my memory of who we were, who we wanted to be on those balconies. And I always come back to this game. It's not something we reminisce about. It lives in my head now. I think there's something special about these unspoken memories. It's their ghostliness. And so it haunts me today as it did last year, and as it did 2 years ago when reading a book for class, I was drawn in by these words. Sometimes after the lights are put out, I say to Alinka, I'm not Eva, I'm Eva's ghost. But I scare myself by the balconies are open doors. I'm Cassandra's ghost.
Okay, sorry about that. So in the interest of time, I want to share a couple of other projects. So I might show just one of them. One of those are final class performances, and you can tell they're a variety. And I could have shown you ones that were about using dance or music, original music or whatever, to tell those stories. Material culture. The material culture, we also do class projects in the class, and what you're seeing here is a mine door, literally a door that had graffiti written on it that was at the bottom of a mine in Northern Ontario. It was retrieved by the local museum, the Science and Technology Museum in Genium, and my students were tasked with, they were each given a piece of the graffiti, and they had to imagine the person who wrote it, why they wrote it, they had to script it, create a backstory, and then perform it. And you can, I guess in the interest of time, I shouldn't really show any of these, but there's the link and you can follow that through. And most of the stories were audio only, but some of them, one of them was performed, and this is on a little documentary film created by the museum. So creating backstories, looking at what was something that we don't know who wrote it, we don't know why they wrote it, but you have to create a scenario and imagine that, and you can follow that up. We've had a PhD student recently that I supervised, and I would like to show you just one short clip from this. Rick spent several years from Sudbury, Ontario, investigating a series of strikes in that community. He did oral history research, recorded those oral histories, and then he scripted them. And we performed them, and they were, again, they were performed in situ. So I'm hoping you can see that screen. That's the mine door one. I'll skip that. And try this link.
I always say that.
Can you hear the sound and see the video?
Just the sounds, not
Just
video.
the sound again? Okay.
Yeah.
I always say that you remember this is a union town when working
Is that working now?
and then
Yeah,
everybody comes.
now it's okay.
Good. I'm going to go to okay, so this was a series of strikes that often the women were blamed for the men settling. So this script was based on the woman's experience from a woman's point of
Union
view.
men, like religious men, are always looking to make converts. Dangerous. Surface too, yes, but my main husband is going underground. I'm active in the 58th strike. Many, many weary hours. There are families in great difficulty, and the strike helps us to organize. Never had any experience in that way. We want to make sure that the help gets to the people who really need it. So we set up a store.
So there's that kind of resentment, right, that builds up, but that quickly dissipates. You know, because some people understand. You've got a mortgage and you have a family, 4 or 5 kids, and you're making straight pay $20 a week, whatever it is you get. It's not enough to feed them.
Hey, Rose. You guys look pretty busy here.
Hey, Gerard. Yeah, lots to do around here.
Well, it's better to be busy, I guess.
Yes, good to be out of the house.
Yeah.
Billy is at home and he's driving me nuts.
No, Loretta keeps sending me out on extra errands. I try not to take it personally.
Long time no see. How goes it?
Well, the roof's gonna hold up, but not so much on the shed.
Oh, that's good about the roof.
The bank stopped sending those letters. You guys did a real good job holding them off.
I had nothing to do with that. I heard some of the guys went and talked to all the banks in town. You better check with yours, though. Some people are still having problems.
Well, it's like the mailman maybe forgot my address.
Something like that.
Yeah.
You want a cup of coffee?
Oh, yeah, sure. Thanks. I can't stay long, though.
Oh, what brings you back?
Yeah, well, Connie and George next door said that you guys had some turkeys that you're giving out for Christmas, so I thought I'd come in and pick one up for us.
Oh, sorry, Jer. There's no more left. I'm so sorry.
Okay, stop share my desktop. Okay, can you see my screen again now?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. So yeah, so that just gives you, I just wanted to give you a short clip of that. So you could see that the words are often taken from the, it's sort of like verbatim documentary theater, as well as it's verbatim documentary theater, but it's also playback theater because the audience that you see are many of the people who were interviewed. And so it really resonated with them, but also led to a constant return. So I'm going to wrap up here by saying that, and apologies again for some of the technical hitches, but all of this is happening within the classroom, within the university, and it's challenging the ways we think about history as a discipline within the field, and engaging with storytelling, engaging with performance strategies, and recognizing our own strategies as storytellers, whether it's finding new media to do things like little puppets, whether it's thinking about how we perform in the archive, as Danny did, or whether we think about these personal stories and places and the ghosts in our memories that as historians, and as Cassandra did, and bringing those all out in front. And Rick's play really ties into the issue of authority, of accuracy, authenticity, using sources and using forces to validate the work that we do. But of course, all that's happening within a university context. And one of the things I'm most chuffed about is that several of the students from the seminar decided to take what we were doing from the class and make it much more public and introduce a whole new level of performativity to their work. So they created a nonprofit organization called Staging Our Histories, and they've had 3 series of performances now over the last few years, where they curate short performances of any sort, films, storytelling, dramatic performances, collaborating with the public, creating spaces for publics to share their stories. And so not only sharing authority, but decentralizing the authority from outside the university into the community. And so taking what we've been wrestling with and to the public, but also bringing the public into those discussions and those conversations. So I want to thank you very much. A little shout out to the students whose work isn't in the public forum yet, for letting me share it. And thanks especially to you for your patience in today and listening to this. So. Right.
Thank you so much. This was really interesting and engaging. I think it was really a productive class as well.
It's you know, do many professors say they can't wait for a class to start and never want it to end? Well, that's my experience with this one. So.
Thank you so much, Professor Dean. So now we can have questions from our audiences. You can raise your virtual hands or ask your questions to the chat box. See any. Okay, let me ask a question then.
There are people raising hands. I don't know if you can see.
Yeah, Rustem had his hand up and somebody else.
Berkem
was first, so I will wait.
is the first.
Yes.
All right, Ben, thank you.
I'm really sorry.
Thank you so much, Professor Dean. That was very informative. I'm enthralled by your presentation. I actually want to ask a question about the formation or actually the notion of authenticity. I know that authenticity is a very loaded term, and I don't want to assume anything. But when we are specifically showing, or at least you in your presentation, you were trying to show the transition from the actual or factual history-based performance to a more like affective and like emotion-based performance that addresses the audience directly. Can we say that like, I know that accuracy and authenticity are 2 different things, but in this context, authenticity has gained a new meaning, sort of. And this affective exchange, this investment has taken to be its new meaning, in my own understanding, from what I heard or understood from your presentation. So can we say that authenticity is now a term for this emotional accuracy or emotional realness? Would that be an accurate approach?
That's certainly where I'm moving towards. I mean, these are still things that I'm thinking through. I've certainly realized that the claim that something is authentic because it's deeply historically accurate, and Kate can jump in here on this because she's done much more work with reenactors than I have, and this is something they wrestle with a lot. but to think of it as in terms of the storytelling, in terms of the storied reality that's grounded in sources, but has to work dramaturgically, artistically, but also historically for contemporary audiences. So yeah, it's a different, it's an emphasis on, in some ways it's about what works, but what works for performance, for an audience, but also what works in our heads. And this has led me to go back to some of the idealist philosophers like Collingwood and Croce and others who, you know, wrestled with these things in the middle of the 20th century, but also earlier historians, you know, in the Renaissance wrestled with these issues of representation and grounding of reality. So I think in the King Lear production, what I realized was that authenticity was caught up in context, and that you know, we were being authentic to Shakespeare's time. We were being authentic to the period that we'd situated the play, which was early Canada, or early contact period, not early Canada, but the early contact period between Europeans and Indigenous people, but also our contemporary context of thousands of missing and murdered Indigenous women, of residential schools and all of that. And that what worked for one was authentic to one didn't work for the other one, or didn't work for the third one. So we were doing with different types of authenticity and different levels of authenticity. And somehow it all had to come together because we had to open the production and it was there. And the Mother Courage one was a great example as well, because I actually had we had a television scene at one point and someone came, you know, a very Brechtian moment, which I'm sure all of you know of. And someone came up to me, charged up to me after in the reception and said, you call yourself a historian? Don't you know there weren't televisions in the 17th century? And, you know, I said, well, yeah, actually I did sort of know that. And, but, you know, so that for that person, it had ruined the whole thing. It was totally and you know, and I was trying to explain, well, the reason we did that is because we're inviting a conversation between past and present. And, you know, the total war of the 17th century, total war in the middle 20th century, total war in our own time, because we're fighting in Afghanistan. That's what we wanted you. And that's authentic, right? It's not faithful to the 17th century costume play that we were not producing, right? So yeah, it's Berkham, you're absolutely right. It's complicated and it's challenging and it's unraveling, because most of my colleagues, you know, tend to see accuracy as grounded in the sources, and that your writing of history will be therefore authentic and will convince audiences. And all of that's starting to unravel as soon as you start thinking about performativity and performance. And I find that really, really exciting. And I hope you could catch a few of the students found that really exciting too, as a possibility. So yeah, it's going to be an ongoing conversation, and I'm going to learn from all of the work that you're doing as well. So yeah, well, thanks for the question.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Thank you.
We have another hands. So let me ask my okay.
Should I?
Okay.
Okay. Thank you very much for a wonderful lecture. It was genuinely inspiring, not only intellectually, but also in terms of exploring the pedagogical possibilities, which I have sometimes failed when I try to incorporate things like fluxus, but your approach is, I think, very promising in different contexts, and it was wonderful. My question is more about the political economy of public history, actually. So at a time when public resources are shrinking, public spaces are shrinking, and so many resources are actually being privatized, including archives and historical resources, as well as space of performance. what's happening to public history and public historians? What's happening to their experiences?
That's a great question. It's I don't want to be overly optimistic, but the reason I can do this work is because my university gives me the resources to do it, gives us the resources to do it. So, you know, for students to be able to shoot a documentary film or to create a podcast, they need technologies and they need resources, they need expertise. And whoever they are at my university recognizes the value of this public outreach. So to be really cynical about it, you tap into resources because it fits into the mandates of the university in terms of public outreach, community, justifying it. So if I wanted to get money to do my personal research project, which is telling the story of a woman fighting a legal claim in the 16th century, you know, that's not of interest. But if I want money to do some street art, street installations, absolutely. And then of course the public is interested in this and the public is engaged. So we do some fundraising. Archives are a stretch for money, museums a stretch for money, but because it's public facing work, those in charge of the money seem to respond well to this sort of impulse and this sort of work. But more generally, in terms of the history discipline, yes, it's, you know, my old university and the University of London at Goldsmiths College, you know, half the faculty are now under threat. They may be fired. And public historians tend, because we're so community centered and so collaborative and so interdisciplinary, we tend to get support from other units and other institutions and more publicly. So I think public history isn't as under threat as other forms of history. And I know that when it comes down to, you know, really mundane things like, you know, as you can tell, I'm gray haired. I'm going to retire in a few years' time, not too long, about 3 years' time. And discussions about, and I've had 5 colleagues leave over the last few years. My field, my area is the one that the department wants to prioritize for replacement, because the university can really see that as, and that's the one we will probably get because of the way public history is so publicly engaged, so community engaged, and so vibrant. So public historians are a little shielded, I guess is what I'm saying, from the threats to that we see in the humanities across. I think also because we're relevant, we speak to fake history. We identify falsities and falsehoods, and we engage with public history in the public sphere. So when our government ministers make claims about the past, which I'm sure you're very much aware of, the misuses of history by politicians. We'll take Donald Trump as the perfect example, or whatever. You know, public historians are at the forefront of criticizing this and the public face of history. So I think that also we're very relevant, we're very active, we're activist historians of various political persuasions. It's not that everyone is of a particular persuasion, and that speaks to it too. So yeah, it's I think I don't want to be overly optimistic, but I think public history is actually growing and expanding. It's certainly, we see that internationally. We've had new programs, appear in Russia, in Indonesia, in all over the world, in Japan, in China. Yeah, so I think it's something that's resonating globally, and I think it's partly the interdisciplinarity and the fact that a public historian is being invited to talk to a group of theater and performance specialists and sociologists in all of your group. We have something to talk about, and that's helping the. Sounds like I'm going to say helping the cause of public history. I don't really mean that it's a movement, but in some ways, maybe it is. I don't know. Actually, maybe it is a movement. But yeah. Think about that.
Okay. Thank you so much. I will just ask my question and then maybe I will take another one. But since it's related to my area, taking the difference between accuracy and authenticity, my question is, what are the visible outcomes of these sort of reenactments of the trauma of the persecuted communities, both for them, for the persecuted communities themselves, but for the persecutors or the heirs of the persecutors as well. Since you said that you were sitting with the audiences to see their reactions, and I was wondering about this and how denial works in these processes as well.
Well, I guess I'd answer that by saying our job is, I mean, I sort of see our role as offering the certainties when we're certain, when we're clear. So if we're faced with deniers, then and faced with those who sort of say, you know, get over it and move on. If I think of our own experience of trauma and genocide here in Canada, the genocide against Indigenous peoples, which is you know, being revealed more and more as the weeks go on, as bodies of unmarked graves, children in unmarked graves are revealed. You know, the historian turns to the archive to find the truth and and listens to the stories that are being told. These are, you know, we know this now because bodies are being uncovered and historians are doing the archive. Indigenous people have known it for generations. And they've told us, and we haven't listened, you know. And so I think our role is to reveal all of those stories, but to also not shy away from the really challenging and difficult ones, that there were perpetuators of these, and they're descendants of the perpetuators of these horrors, and that their story needs to be told and listened to too, because otherwise we can't have reconciliation. True reconciliation, and is our purpose to not, I think if we learn from Indigenous peoples, the purpose is not to shame people, but to understand. And in that understanding, we can hopefully move forward in a spirit of togetherness to reconciliation. But before we can even get there, we need to acknowledge that we need to start using the word genocide, which we don't like using at all. We have a phrase, cultural genocide, which most settlers and immigrants are more comfortable with, the government's more comfortable with, but increasingly we're realizing that we need to use the word genocide, and that is a pillar of the Canadian state that was created, and that's a horrific pillar, and we need to come to terms with it. And a very small gesture is the land acknowledgement that I began with, which is, you know, is hollow in many ways. It's a sort of programmatic. It's become a bit programmatic. But, you know, I've not heard colleagues in Europe apologize or acknowledge that their wealth and their privilege of their university comes from slavery, for example, or comes from colonialism. And so I think that's it's a small gesture, but it's an important gesture, and it's a marker. So I think going back to the start of your question about, I think, again, the accuracy is really important. The sort of veracity of the sources is really important, but also to understand that the authentic experience, or the experience of people of those traumas, may not actually be related to the minutiae of the veracity of the documents, right? That the documents don't capture the intergenerational horror, which is what we're actually dealing with, and what we need to deal with, and what we need to come to terms with. So it's, yeah, that's a profound, and that's a big question, and I think it's yeah, when we deal with deniability, then that's when we turn to the accuracy or the veracity of the sources. But again, we can only present those and perform them. We don't know whether they'll convince. right? And there are people who you can present with all the historical evidence possible. You can perform oral testimonies. You can have people crying in the spaces that you're performing these stories, and they still, there's some people who will still never change their ideas, and at some point you have to say, well, you know, I fulfilled my role as a storyteller, and what they're taking from it is what they're taking from it. So it doesn't mean that we're even-handed in any way like that, right? You see what I mean? Yeah. Does that answer your question? I'm not quite sure. Yeah.
Yes. Yes. Thanks a lot.
Yeah.
Any other question? I think we don't have. No. Okay. So. Thank you very much, Professor Dean.